Welcome to the last week in the Theory and Practice of Cryptography course, and it's my pleasure to welcome Ben Adida to give the final talk on cryptographic voting protocols and verifying elections with cryptography. Ben is currently on the research faculty at Harvard Medical School working on some of the privacy aspects of electronic medical records, and has done a lot of work with voting in the past, and is also on the research group at Harvard. And so, without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Ben.
Hi, everyone. Last year at this time, almost exactly at this time, I gave a talk on voting. If you were at that talk, don't worry, you'll get new information at this talk. If you were not at that talk, don't worry either. I'll go over some of the basic stuff I went over back then. But this talk should be more technical. You guys have had a little bit of crypto with Steve. So we'll get into some details of cryptographic voting protocols. And I'm going to try to keep the beginning of it high level, very sort of general protocols, and dig into the crypto about halfway through, approximately. So please interrupt me at any time with questions. I prefer them when you think of them as opposed to at the end. So raise your hand, and Steve, you'll let me know if somebody asks online. So please don't hesitate to IM Steve or whatever you do to ask a question over the network. So as Steve said, right now I'm a research faculty at the Harvard Medical School where I think about privacy of health records. But for my entire PhD and for a chunk of my time right now, I think about what cryptography can bring to the field of elections, in the sense that elections, well, there's issues around elections, right? Last year, there were a whole bunch of articles published right around election time. And the articles went something like this. Does e-voting need paper trails? There was one state sued over the lack of paper trail. Actually, more than one state sued in that situation. There was an HBO documentary which came out really right around election time that said basically your vote's not going to count, it's going to be trashed, you might as well not vote. In California, there was a report that said that the voting machines there were letting people vote more than once. And basically 3 days before the election, there was a report that said Hugo Chavez is in your voting machine. And this was, the headline was justified because a board member of one of the voting machine companies turned out to be from Venezuela and had some prior business associations with Hugo Chavez. Thus, Hugo Chavez is in your voting machine. So on the one hand, you had all these articles that said, we're in trouble, right? You might as well not vote or vote by mail or vote on paper. Whatever you can do, just find a piece of paper and write your vote on it. And on the other hand, you had the head of the Election Assistance Commission, Paul DiGregorio. The Election Assistance Commission is a federal organization created after the Florida 2000 election fiasco that said, OK, we're going to fix this, right? And Paul DiGregorio wrote an editorial on October 26, 2006 that said, don't worry, everything's cool. Your vote's going to count. And the thing I want you to notice here is that you have these extreme statements. On the one hand, your vote's not going to count. On the other hand, your vote is definitely going to count. And on both sides, you have no real evidence one way or the other, because we have very little information as to whether the elections are going well. We have very little information because the process of elections is such that we end up with very little information about whether they were successful. And this talk is going to be about how we can use techniques from cryptography to give us a lot more auditability than you would think is even possible in the case of an election. Of course, things do go bad sometimes, and I can't have an election talk without talking about some of the funny times when they go bad. Here's one quote right after the election. In Rogers Precinct, there was more than 100% voter turnout. That's even better than Russia. It's shocking. Better than 100%. In another case, a thief grabbed a voting machine from an election official's car. Now, you have to ask yourself, what was the voting machine doing in the election official's car to begin with? Well, you have to understand that to get all these voting machines at 5 a.m. in every voting location, the only practical way to do so in some cases is to have the election officials pick them up the night before and drive them in the morning of the elections. So there's all sorts of subtle process issues around actually running an election which make it particularly hard and which lead to such silly headlines. And then, of course, people got really upset, and then one voter smashed a touchscreen machine in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Now, you read that headline, you think maybe the press is just exaggerating. Turns out they're not. They really did smash that voting machine in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And of course, we're gearing up for another election season. So this is all stuff that I talked about last year, but we have new issues coming up. Right now, in Colorado, the state has just disallowed a whole bunch of voting machines, including touchscreens, optical scans, and the statement they've made is a very strong one. They've said the standards for evaluating voting machines at the federal level standards, are no good. We cannot trust the federal standards. We're going to have our own standards for evaluating voting machines. It's a pretty strong statement, as far as election official statements go. And this might trigger a few other states to do the same thing. In Ohio, there was a security review that was just published last week about some of the voting machines they use there. And they found out that using a PDA with the infrared port and a magnet to dislodge something inside the voting machine, they're able to basically completely override the software that runs the voting machine and therefore completely corrupt whatever that voting machine is doing. So things are pretty bad in terms of voting machine equipment, in terms of the process, but they're very bad because it's quite hard. And now I'm going to tell you a little bit about why it's hard. This is an excerpt from a story that I also showed this last year. I really love showing this because it represents one of the core issues of designing cryptographic protocols or secure protocols in general. Here's a story about a guy who was running for an election, and his wife, in a tiny, tiny locality, and his wife, Roxanne, goes to City Hall to see the election results, and he got 0 votes. So she comes home to him and says, hey, did you vote for yourself? Because if you did, then something's wrong with the election. And if you didn't, then why didn't you, right? But what's funny about this is not so much that there were 0 votes for him. It's that his wife came home to ask him if he'd voted for himself, because what this means is she clearly didn't vote for him, right? If she'd voted for him, she wouldn't need to ask him this question, right? And the reason I point this out is because there are inherent limits to what you can do with certain protocols. The security can only be so good. If you get 0 votes, it doesn't matter how secure the process is, you know your wife didn't vote for you, right? It doesn't matter how good the rest of the protocol is. So it's interesting when you design security protocols to look at the inputs and outputs and figure out what the best case scenario is. And in the voting case, there are limits to what you can do. Here's a little bit of history, some of you might know it, about how we got here in the first place. And it helps to explain things a little bit. In the beginning of mechanization of voting machines in the 1920s and 30s approximately, we had these lever machines that came out. And these machines basically had counters, and you turn these little levers, and if you lived in New York in the past few years, you've seen them in use. They're still in use in some places. I don't know what the status is for 2008. They're supposed to be phasing them out, but you never know. So you turn some levers next to the names you want, and there are some fancy hardware interlocks that prevent you from voting for 2 different candidates in the same race. And then you pull this big lever, and ka-chink, all the levers reset. Your vote is counted. Don't worry, everything is cool. You can leave the voting booth now. In fact, they had set them up so that when you pull the lever, it also opened the curtain at the same time. So it's very convenient. So these machines may have issues. In particular, they only keep an aggregate count of the ballots, and they're mechanical, so they have mechanical failures. And so there was a statistical analysis done on results based on elections that were run with this kind of equipment, and it turns out that the digit 9 appears a lot more often in these election results than it should randomly. And the reason for that is that these counters tend to get stuck when they turn. And when they get stuck, they usually get stuck rolling over between 9 and 0. So when you vote and you're at 9, your vote might not get counted, right? It might not trigger the thing to roll over. In the 50s and 60s, we decided, OK, well, these punch cards that we're using for computers, they could be useful for tabulating votes too. And in fact, it was actually quite a good idea because if a punch card system works well, you have a record of every ballot. One ballot is one card, right? And if everything goes smoothly, you can do recounts, you can inspect them and try to see which holes have been punched and such. But of course, we know the story with what happens when the equipment gets old and when people don't punch holes all the way, and butterfly ballots make people vote for the wrong candidate potentially. It can get messy, in part because the layout of the ballots was made to fit these punch cards. And so the weird butterfly design, if you've ever seen the Florida 2000 ballot, where you have candidates on the left and on the right and arrows pointing from both sides, and it's kind of hard to align which one is which, that is because of the constraints of punch cards with these holes that are close together. And so you're trying to maximize how much data you can fit on one of these punch cards. The principle was a good idea. Fitting the user interface to the technology turns out to have pretty disastrous effects when the race is close. Then eventually we started moving to optical scanners. At first the scanners were centrally located, meaning you filled out your ballot and then you just dropped it in a box, and eventually they were moved to a central location and scanned there. The problem with that is that if there's a mistake on your ballot, you filled in too many bubbles, you don't get any feedback right away. In fact, the only time we know that you filled in too many bubbles for one candidate is when it's too late. At the central location, when we count your ballot, it's a bad ballot, oh well. There's no way to reach the voter again. So we moved to precinct-based optical scan, where if you voted in Massachusetts, you've seen these, and they're kind of all over the place now. There's about 40 to 50% of voting machines that work like this. You fill in some bubbles, you feed in the paper, it gets scanned. If there's an error, it gets spit out, and you're told there's an error, and you get a chance to revote. And then, of course, there's the touchscreen machines. The main advantage that touchscreen machines have over optical scan is in places where there's a whole bunch of different languages. In LA County, you need to support 16 different languages, and having 16 different pre-printed optical scan ballots, 16 different types of pre-printed ballots, is very painful. So there's a good reason for all of these technical progressions, but security was never the major issue. And if you talk to election officials, you find out that really they care about people participating in the election first. That's the major issue that they try to solve. And then security effectively becomes second. Any questions so far? Is that, yeah? All right, I'm trying to, yeah.
Did Diebold change its name because they got a bad name?
Did Diebold change its name? Yeah, they just changed their name to Premier Election Systems. Not the whole company, just the election department, yeah. Any other questions? To be extra fair, I think Diebold gets a lot of the rap, but really none of the vendors have done that much in that regard. They've tried in very good faith to make elections easier. But the problem is that we have no evidence that things are working well. And so they could be working poorly, right? Do the touchscreen-based solution produce paper? Some of them have been adapted to produce paper trails. The machines that are adapted to produce paper trails tend to perform poorly in usability tests because of the fact that they've been retrofitted with these printers that break and jam and such things. So machines that are designed from the start to have paper trails tend to work better. Yeah?
Just as a comment, I remember seeing the documentary that even machines that had paper trails, they have found election officials throwing them away into garbage. So even with paper trails, if you don't have a process that actually works afterwards, there's no reason to have them.
Right. The comment is that even with paper trails, you can throw away the paper trails. And that's exactly what I'll get to. In fact, I think I'm going to speed up a little bit because it sounds like you guys are really on top of this stuff. So I just want to briefly mention a couple of things that were funny. Last year, here was the Princeton report. They were able to build, a vote stealing control panel into one of these touchscreen voting machines, where you just get to slide the slider and decide who wins. And they were able to infect the voting machines this way so that the voting machines would act normal but record votes in whatever way you wanted them to record them. They were able to modify all the audit logs to be consistent and spread this virally by memory card from one machine to the other. But it's not just touchscreen machines, or as they're sometimes called, DREs, for direct recording by electronics. The word direct, I don't think, was intended as a pun, given how indirect the recording is, since you're going through the machine. But that's what it's called, direct recording by electronics. It turns out that in some optical scan systems, if you put a Post-it in the right location, you can prevent the little detector that says you voted from being triggered, and then you can pull your ballot out and vote again, and pull your ballot out and vote again, and keep doing this a few times. Hopefully, the election official would be able to detect this, but maybe not. All right, that's the fun history. It's really easy to talk trash about this stuff. What can we do, right? How can cryptography help? Now, if you've listened to the past lectures that Steve gave, for the most part, and if you look at the way cryptography is handled for the most part in the press, you think of it as a military type of technology. A technology that's there to preserve secrets, to preserve authenticity, to basically generally keep things in the dark, or at least to keep things, to keep secrets, effectively. There's a whole aspect of cryptography, though, that has to do with proving that things happen correctly, with verifying that things happen correctly. And you can begin to see it when you talk about digital signatures. But I think that Steve briefly mentioned zero-knowledge proofs before, and that's really the area where cryptography can do a whole range of things that have nothing to do with military-style applications. They have to do with auditability. And they have to do with auditability in situations you wouldn't think were auditable to begin with. And that's the kind of cryptography we're going to use for this kind of protocol. So the point of an election, and the reason we want this is because the point of an election is to convince the loser that he's lost. This is a real quote from 1966. You want it to be such that the loser can be as angry as he wants, but at least he's in agreement that he's lost. So providing enough evidence to convince the loser. OK, but you also want to provide enough, in the process, you want to provide enough evidence to each individual voter that their vote was correctly recorded. So we'll take Alice, our usual character in cryptographic protocols, and we'll say, OK, a voting system, whatever the system is, needs to convince Alice that her vote was properly captured. But then we have this issue of the secret ballot, this idea that Alice can't turn around and convince Carl, the coercer, that she voted a certain way. Now, this is tricky. Alice has to receive enough evidence to be sure on her own that her vote was correctly captured, but not so much evidence that she can turn around and pass it on to a coercer. And what's really tricky is this is not a voluntary choice. We want it to be such that even if Alice is willing to be coerced, paid $1,000, have her dog, maybe, if her dog is threatened and she's like, I love my dog, I cannot imagine living without my dog, I'm happy to be coerced for my dog. Even in that case, we want to prevent that from happening. So it's not voluntary privacy of the vote, it's enforced ballot secrecy. We didn't always have it that way. This is actually a fairly recent concept. This is how we voted in the early days of US elections. Here's the guy in red voting in front of the whole crowd, giving his vote to the guy in blue who's swearing him in. And the two people behind there are recording, for duplicate. This is like an early version of RAID mirroring, right? Like 2 copies of the record. It was only in 1892 that we adopted the Australian ballot from Australia, which included, among other things, the idea that you would show up and be isolated in a private booth to vote, and that there would be some enforced secrecy as to how this works. All clear about that? That's the key issue that makes this hard. It's the fact that we have to give you some confidence without giving you too much, right? Just the right amount. And it's really this kind of dilemma, this kind of these conflicting requirements that can be best resolved by tools like cryptography. So I like to make elections talks a little more current. So I've updated my slides to talk about election 2008. And I believe since I'm talking to the Google crowd, these are probably the 2 candidates that matter the most at this point. So let's assume that come election 2008, we're dealing with Barack Obama versus Ron Paul. And let's see how the process works, right? I apologize to those who would not choose those 2 candidates. I had to pick 2, right? Alice, the voter, is going to pick Obama. And she's going to pick Obama because I get to write the slides. She's going to seal her vote in some way. Then she's going to drop this vote off in the ballot box. Then there's this weird cutoff. If you voted, you know this. You drop it off, and then that's it. You're kind of not involved. You go home, and at some point, the results are announced. And again, Obama wins here because I get to write the slides. There's this black box here. There's this sort of part of the process you can sort of see depending on which precinct you're in, but oftentimes you just don't get to see it. You drop off your vote, you go home, you turn on the TV, and you found out who won, right? We've done this because we want to preserve ballot secrecy, and it's the only way we can think of doing it, is to have this cutoff at which point identity is now dissociated from the ballot. We shake the ballot box, and that's it. We just count after that. And so security of the system has to be enforced by a chain of custody. And the chain of custody goes something like this. Somebody writes source code. It gets installed on a voting machine. It gets delivered to the polling location. Alice votes. There's a ballot cutoff. There's a ballot box collection. And there's a result. And every step of that process, corruption could lead to a bad result. Bad source code, or good source code that's poorly installed, or a voter twiddling with a magnet and a PDA could screw up the vote. We have this chain of custody security process because it's the only way we can think of getting the ballot secrecy, right? And as somebody mentioned very accurately, the paper trail gets you the following thing. It bypasses all of this process at the beginning, but it doesn't really help you for the ballot box collection, which really is a black box at that point, and the paper trails could very much go away. So what happens? Well, because we rely on a chain of custody, we get ballot box floating in San Francisco Bay. That happened in 2002. We get helicopters crashing in Afghanistan, probably not on purpose, but that affected the vote because they were carrying ballot boxes. Absentee ballots lost in Florida. Mexican presidential election last year, ballots found in the dump. And 18,000 votes last year in Sarasota that looked very fishy. And it's really hard to tell what happened to them. All right. Let me skip ahead for a second because I'm taking a little longer with this than I thought. But let me just tell you very quickly that it's very clear that people often ask the question after all of this, they say, well, maybe secrecy is not so important. Maybe we should just do away with ballot secrecy. Maybe we should all vote in public, make our voices heard. Everybody's in the same boat. We all get to voice our choices. And then we get perfect verifiability, right? It's not a crazy argument, but it turns out that the data we have from Chile, which is the only time in recent history that a change has happened in the secret ballot, the data we have is when you implement the secret ballot, you get huge changes in the political outcome. In other words, coercion, whether it's employer to employee or spouse to spouse or parent to child or whatever it is rampant when you don't have the secret ballot. So we think it's important. So now the question is, we must have secrecy and we must do better than chain of custody verification. So what can cryptography bring us? Let me restate those properties. We want Alice to verify her vote. Alice is going to vote. We want to make sure her vote is counted as she intends. Everyone wants to verify that the counting up of the votes was done correctly. And we got this third requirement that Alice cannot be coerced by Eve.
You want Alice to verify your vote after the fact or at the voting station?
We want, from a process standpoint, the question was, should Alice verify her vote at the polling station or after the fact? After the fact. We want her to be able to have some confidence of the whole process, not just of the point where she gives her vote, right? So remember, at some point we had public ballots. So let's start with public ballots and let's augment them to support the secret ballot. We have Bridget and Carol who have already voted, and now Alice is going to vote and post her vote on a public bulletin board. You know, just everybody can see it. And then everybody can tally, and everybody's happy, right? Alice sees her vote, everybody tallies, everything is great. How do we make it secret? Well, let's encrypt things, right? Let's start by encrypting the ballots that are on the bulletin board. OK, now we know that Alice has voted, but we don't know what she voted for. And it's unclear how Alice verifies that her vote was correctly encrypted. So we need a process for that. How does Alice verify that her vote was correctly encrypted? And then how do we tally things that are encrypted, right? If we've got encrypted votes, how do you count them? All cryptographic protocols for voting are based on this concept. The idea of a public bulletin board where you can see everybody's name and their encrypted ballot, and then 2 processes. One, to allow Alice to verify that her vote was properly encrypted, and 2, to count encrypted votes. Is that clear at a high level? At this point, you should be like, OK, but there's some serious black magic happening here, because what's going on? Yes? Sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, is there an issue about people knowing that somebody has or hasn't voted? So in some countries,
Is there an issue about learning whether somebody has voted? That's a very good question. People disagree on that. In today's system, you can find out who has voted. It's actually considered a security feature that you can go and find out if your neighbor has voted, because if you find out that your neighbor was homesick, then you know somebody was stuffing the ballot box. So in the current legislation in the US and in many other countries, you can find out who has voted, and so this doesn't change that property. Yes?
Is there a way for Alice to verify that Rich was a full person?
So the registration lists should also be public. You can go find out who is registered to vote, what their address is, and that's how you get all the political mail, by the way. It's because those lists are public. And so is your party affiliation. That's why you get all this mail. So yes, that should be a public resource where you can go make sure that the person living here is really a person as opposed to a business or an empty lot. Any other questions? Yes?
there's another issue, which is knowing that it really was Alice who voted and left and voted, which is about the voter vote. When you go and cast your vote, how the people who accept your vote know that it's really you voting and not somebody else.
I couldn't quite hear the rest of it.
Sorry, it's the knowing that when Alice turns up to vote, it really is Alice voting and not somebody else.
Oh, identification, yes. That is definitely an issue, yes. It's an issue that is actually much more social than it is technical, because we could enforce really strict requirements for authenticating when you come in to vote. But then there's a problem as to who has the means to gain those authentication tokens and such. So oftentimes we like to handle this with a very serious threat of federal prison if if like Ann Coulter, you vote in 2 different places, then maybe you might go to jail. Who knows? Christmas is around the corner. Any other questions? Yes?
That actually provides the coercion capability, because Alice says, okay, you want me to vote for this? Well, okay, here's my identification. The coercer sends somebody that could conceivably be assumed to be Alice,
Right.
to make the vote.
Right. You do want to ensure, and again, this is certainly an issue that needs more exploration. Generally, from everything I've found, it tends to be much more of a social issue. For example, even requiring ID is something that will prevent a whole bunch of people from voting. So there's a give and take here you have to be very careful about to somehow make sure there isn't massive fraud while at the same time massive disenfranchisement, which is a problem. It's a tough one. I think it's a lot more social than technical in that case. And this, in general, this is the difficulty with voting, right? Everything you try to do has a social impact. I'm not talking too much about the social impact of using cryptography here, but I'm happy to take questions about it at the end, because there are certainly issues there. So the question everybody should be asking is, OK, great, how do we verify stuff when there's encrypted data? How do we, it's garbled. The whole point is we can't tell what it is. How do we verify? So this is the idea that Steve mentioned before of the zero-knowledge proof. I'm going to dig into some more technical stuff now. The zero-knowledge proof is the basic construct that allows us to do verification of operations on encrypted data, among other things, but in this case. Here's the example I like to use. And last year I did this with physical envelopes. If I want to convince you that I can give you an envelope that contains the word Obama, not a specific envelope, just I want to make sure that you get an envelope, a closed, sealed envelope, and you're convinced that that envelope contains the word Obama. How might I go about doing that? Well, I could give you 1 million envelopes, all containing the word Obama. And you could open all of them except one. And you get to choose the one you don't open, right? So I give you 1 million, you open all but one. You find out that all the ones you open say Obama. You're pretty darn sure that the remaining one says Obama because you got to pick which one wasn't opened. Does that make sense? That interactive process of me committing to something by sealing 1 million envelopes and you challenging me by opening all of them but one and having something left is the classic interactive protocol of a zero-knowledge proof. And we can do it with data by doing encryption instead of sealed envelopes. And we can do it with really funky math underneath that makes it way more efficient than having to do 1 million envelopes. But the principle is that, right? Now, at that point, you may say, OK, but now I've got myself one closed envelope and 999,999 open envelopes that say Obama. And if I walk out of the voting booth with that, then it's pretty clear to anybody else, given all these envelopes I have, what happened, right? OK, so I forgot to, there you go, click through those two things. The last envelope likely contains Obama, but now you have all this evidence of the process. OK, fine, so we're going to give you fake evidence for the other process, right? Before you walk out of the booth, I'm going to give you 999,999 open envelopes that say Ron Paul. And now you're walking out with these two sets of open envelopes, and your coercer is saying, what does that closed envelope say? And you say, it says Obama, I promise, I did this interaction, I opened all these envelopes, they all said Obama. And the coercer says, yeah, but all these other envelopes say Ron Paul, so which one is it? What actually happened in the booth there? And you have no evidence to convince this person of which one happened. You know in your head what happened. You're convinced of what happened, but you can't prove it. Is that clear? Because that is the crux of most of this stuff, right? Any questions?
Were the million envelopes other people's votes?
No. They're just stuff that gets trashed afterwards. Like we're generating 1 million envelopes on the fly. You open all of them, and the one that you don't open ends up being your vote. But the others go away.
I think the question is, we understand the analogy, the metaphor, but not how it applies.
Not what? I'm sorry?
How it applies yet?
Right, so sorry, I didn't repeat the question. The question was whether these 1 million envelopes were the votes of other people. And no, in this case, this is purely for one person voting. We generate all this extra data, and then eventually we destroy it. And then the second question was, how does this actually apply? I'm going to show you that just now. You have to partially trust that we can do this electronically in a way that doesn't actually create 1 million physical envelopes. And that's a hint of how it applies. But exactly how you make these protocols human verifiable is very tricky. I'm going to show you an example of how we do that just now. Any other questions about the general concept? Yes?
I'm a little bit puzzled because there seem to be two parties involved here. The person you're trying to register your vote with, the election authority,
Yes.
and the guy you're trying to conceal from how you actually voted. And the zero knowledge proof thing seems to be more to do with how you actually vote rather than how you tell the...
It's both. It's a way of being sure that the system that's letting you vote is encoding the right vote, while at the same time preventing you from selling it. So it's playing both sides, basically. Does that? And the question was, there's a confusion. There's two things that seem to be happening here, right? The person who's helping you encode the vote and the person who's trying to coerce you. Does that answer your question? OK, yeah. There is an issue that maybe you're hinting at, which is that the person who's creating those envelopes for you knows how you voted, right? Obviously. And that is always the case when you're entering data into a machine or when you're scanning it. There is a machine or some piece of the equipment at that point that could know how you voted in that case. It's something, there is an issue there that we can dig into. Yes?
So the million envelope, the guy closing the envelope can write Alice voted for Obama.
I'm sorry, the guy closing the envelope can?
Write Alice's name on it so that she gets caught when...
Yes, OK, that's a very good point. So the person, the question is the guy writing the envelope could encode some information on it, maybe an invisible ink that says this is Alice voting or something or other that later allows you to trace that vote to Alice. And this is actually a very real worry in cryptographic voting systems, where there's all this random data that goes into encryption, as you probably have seen over the last few weeks. You get to pick the randomness. So there could be some steganographic technique for embedding Alice's name into the ciphertext, and there are protocols that defend against that. But it's a brilliant question. Yes, yes. In the back?
If I was a coercer, wouldn't I just change my tactics? Like if I didn't want Paul or Obama to win, I would just target Googlers and say, if I see that you voted, you're going to be in trouble. And that, by de facto, will suppress the Obama.
You guys are way ahead of me. Yeah, that's excellent. And actually, there's a... The question, thanks, Steve. The question is, I could switch my coercion technique and just make sure that nobody in Mountain View votes, right? If I say anybody in Mountain View votes, I shoot them, right? That's all I do. Like if I see that you vote, I'm just going to shoot you, right? So basically, target a region that you know votes one way or another, right? And force them not to vote. This is a real issue. And you can force them in different ways. You can have fewer voting machines in that area, for example, which has happened in the past, right? There's lots of ways to do that based on the knowledge of who voted. And I don't have a good answer for that because this is a real issue. There's another issue that's related if you're interested in this, and I'm perfectly happy to go down these paths. There's a kind of attack called a forced randomization attack, where you can't force somebody to vote a certain way, but if the protocol is formed in a certain way, you can force their vote to effectively become random. So I don't know how you voted, but I know that you probably didn't vote for who you wanted. So again, I can target an area like Mountain View and force randomizations by coercion of a bunch of votes, and I've effectively reduced the votes for Obama, right? These are excellent questions. These are the reasons why voting is so hard, right? All right, let me run ahead because I think I'm 33 minutes in or so, and I do want to get to some. I can run it. Well, I know that people have other things to do. You know, you guys produce software too, right? So you don't just sit in talks. So I want to present a system that I co-designed with Ron Rivest. Don't try to poke too many practical holes in the system because this system is meant for pedagogical use. It's meant to explain how you would do these things in the real world. It does have certain practical weaknesses, but there's only so much we can cover in an hour, and I think this can be pretty useful. I'm going to go through it a little quickly too because I have done this before, and there's some interesting principles in the end that are particularly cool. The general idea is you arrive at the voting booth and you receive 2 ballots. In fact, you might get to pick them from 2 different piles, right? And the ballots look like this. They have perforations where the dotted lines are, down the vertical and over here above this gray area, which is a scratch surface, kind of like a lottery scratch surface, right? This is a 2D barcode, which contains information. I'll tell you what information later. And the order of the candidates is randomized on the ballots. So likely you're going to get 2 ballots with 2 different orders of candidates. And then there's spaces for you to check marks on the right-hand side of the ballot. Okay? At this point, you, the voter, are going to pick 1 ballot to audit and 1 ballot to vote with. Okay? You get to choose. You flip the coin and decide which one you want to vote with. The one you want to audit, at the voting location, there's a place with a barcode scanner. You get to scratch off the scratch surface, which reveals some random data. And by scanning this and scanning this data that you just revealed, the display on the reader should tell you exactly what's on the left side. None, Paul, Obama, right? I'll tell you how that works in just a second. But the point is, as a voter, you come in, you pick a ballot to vote with. The other ballot, you scratch off, beep, beep. You look at it, you compare, you say, yep, that sounds good. And then you destroy that ballot. The scratch surface is basically void if scratched, right? Just like lottery tickets sometimes. So that ballot you destroy, you go vote with the other ballot. At that point, if somebody was trying to cheat you with a bad ballot, and I'll tell you what those are in a second, they had a 50-50 chance of getting caught. And in a typical precinct with 200 voters, they're pretty much assured of being caught if they try to corrupt more than just a couple of votes, just a handful of votes. And of course, if any bad ballot is found, we do a serious investigation, right? Like all the way to the source, who printed them, who manufactured them, why was this wrong, et cetera, right? So there's a first level of auditing here. Interestingly, this level of auditing can be done by a political organization. A lot of these cryptographic voting schemes have to do with empowering auditors, not just you, but anybody else. Let's say the ACLU, the NRA, they're all there, ready to help you audit your ballot. You pick one, you give the one to the NRA, and you say, check it. And they check it, they say, it's good, you can go vote. Good, you move ahead. Right? Empowering activist organizations, and generally all of these political organizations that have a desire to make sure the election is happening properly, is a very powerful side effect of these cryptographic auditing techniques. All right, so you checked 1 ballot, you're about to go vote with the other. Now you're in private, you're in the voting booth, and now you mark Obama, because I get to write the slides. And at this point, you have selected Obama, and you then, in private, tear this thing in half along the dotted lines, right? And you discard the left half. The left half goes in a bin, in a shredder, or whatever. In fact, ideally, there's a whole bunch of other left halves there, so you can take another one and claim you voted a different way, right? It's the principle here that counts. So now you step out of the voting booth with just the right half. And the right half no longer says who you're voting for. It's just, it just looks like this. Who knows who you're voting for at this point? You then show this to an election official who verifies that this scratch surface has not been tampered with, that you haven't looked underneath it. At which point, this gets detached and shredded in public view. This then gets scanned. This piece that remains gets scanned, and you also get to take it home. That's your ballot. Here is the public bulletin board with ballots. You have no idea whether these votes are the same or not. It turns out Alice and Bridget could have the same vote, and Alice and Carol, even though their vote is in the same position, could be different votes. It depends on the ballot. And the details of the ballot are encrypted in this 2D barcode. It's a 2D barcode so we can stuff more data onto the paper. That's all it is, right? Yes?
So in the first step, you had 2 cards. Can you explain why there were 2 cards? Why did you throw away one in the first step?
To audit, to make sure that the ballot you're dealing with is properly formed. Because what you want to do is you want to make sure that whatever's encoded in here matches the candidate ordering you're seeing on the left half. Yes? I'm sorry, I forgot to say what the question was, which was, why did you have 2 ballots in the first place? You had 2 ballots in the first place because one of them is for auditing and the other one is for actual voting. Sorry, go ahead.
I probably just missed. So if you took the thing with check home, what goes on the bulletin board?
It gets scanned. So and a copy is posted on the bulletin board. Yes, so that's why you get to take it home, because you're also scanning it. I'm repeating it because I forgot to repeat the question again. OK, so now we're about to dig into sorry, oh yeah.
Sorry, behind you. Can you explain again what was the purpose on the second vote? It had the bottom scratch and vote part, and you said take that scratch out and throw it away.
I was actually going to ask the audience if they, at the end of this, why they thought we threw that away. The question was, what do we do with the scratch surface at the bottom of it? Let me go through 2 more slides, and then I'll answer the question, if that's OK with you. Because I'm about to tell you what's in the data and what's under that scratch surface, and it should explain why we have to destroy it. So now I'm about to get a little more technical still. You guys remember ElGamal encryption? ElGamal encryption, you don't have to remember the details exactly. You just have to remember that you have a public key Y and a secret key X, and the public key is G to the X modulo a prime. I'll go over the math. If you're following it, great. If you're not, hopefully you'll still see how this works.
And G and P are well known.
And G and P are well known, yes. We agree on those parameters at the beginning of the election. P is a large prime at this point, and G is what's called a generator of ZP star. To encrypt a message, we create a ciphertext that's composed of 2 values. The first value is this generator G, exponentiated to a random R that we pick at the time of encryption. And the second value is M times Y to the R, Y being the public key. Now, why do we do this? We do this because, first of all, by picking a random number, there can be many different ciphertexts for the same plain text, right? That's really important in an election, because when there's only 3 candidates, if encrypting the word Obama always gave the same thing, it would be very easy to tell who voted the same way, right? So encrypting Obama has to give a different ciphertext every time. So that's why there's randomization in there. Decryption happens by taking this first value, G to the R, exponentiating it to the private key, so that G to the power of R to the power of X, which is the same thing as G to the power of X to the power of R. And G to the power of X is Y, so that's Y to the power of R. And we can factor that out of the second number, and we get the message back, right? So using the secret key X, we can effectively factor out the randomization from the second part of the ciphertext and get the message back. Now, why am I telling you all this? Because ElGamal has a really cool property called the homomorphic property. You can probably forget most of what I just told you, except notice that if you take the encryption of a message, M1, and the encryption of another message, M2, and you multiply them together, you get the encryption of the product. This is how it works in details. The only thing you need to notice is that the randomization factors get added up in the exponent, and the messages get multiplied. And so that's it. You take two ciphertexts, you multiply them together, you get the ciphertext of the product. OK, well, that's not all that useful to multiply stuff in elections. But it would be really useful to add stuff, right? If we could add stuff under the covers of encryption, we take ciphertexts and we can add them together without knowing what we're adding, we would have some fairly powerful primitive, right? Wouldn't it be nice if we could do it with an addition instead? Well, we can. We can just by tweaking ElGamal and putting the message in the exponent, right? When we multiply things, messages in the exponent get added, right? So instead of m over here, we do g to the m. And then we can add stuff. Of course, when you decrypt, now you have to do this logarithm operation, discrete logarithm operation, which is hard to do. So it turns out messages have to be short, maybe 20, 25 bits, 30 bits if you've got Google MapReduce, right? But, limited in size. So taking the discrete log base G is OK for short messages. But really what you want to be using is this much more complicated crypto system down here called the Payet crypto system, which lets you do the same additive operation with much more efficient. Hey, there's the dog. I guess we were not coerced. Successfully, at least. So with the Payet crypto system, you can decrypt messages much more efficiently, even if they're thousands of bits long. So I'm giving you an example with ElGamal, but really for these systems, you'd want to use Payet. That's not a problem. Don't worry. My wife will find this very amusing when she sees it on YouTube. So what we do now with these messages we can add, right? If we were voting yes, no, we could just have yes be 1 and no be 0. And when we have encryptions of 1 and 0, we could just sum them up together homomorphically and get one encryption at the very end of the election, just one ciphertext, and decrypt that one ciphertext and get the counters, get all of the results, get the result for the yes, no. Well, we're not voting yes, no. We're voting, Obama, Paul, and none, or Green Party and other candidates potentially. So what do? Well, we just take the bit space that we have and we slice it up into different counters, right? There's only so many voters in the US. 28 bits is actually plenty to represent the number of people in the US. So with 1,000 bits, we have plenty of space for multiple counters, right? So a vote for none would be a 1 offset appropriately. A vote for Obama would be a 1 offset this way, and a vote for Paul would be just a 1. And then if you have these encrypted 1s offset to the right position, you can just multiply them all together, literally. I mean, you just take these values that are ciphertexts and multiply them all together. And at the end of the election, potentially for the entire US, you have one ciphertext, 1024 bits. And you just decrypt that, and you have your sums. Yes?
So you can do multiplication and addition with cryptographic text. You can do all the computations.
So you can't do both, sadly. In the same system, we don't know how to do both. The question was, if you could do multiplication and addition of ciphertext, you could do all computation under the covers of encryption. It would be beautiful. It would be a revolution. And we don't know how to do it. It's not clear we can do both in the same crypto system. You'd have to switch between one and the other, and then you can't do it anymore. Yes?
So if there was a tampering result with one single vote, you would not be able to repeat, right?
I didn't quite hear the question. There was a...
If there was a tampering with the result on a single vote,
Yes.
The result of the sum would not be decreased, right?
Probably, although you'd probably have to be more worried about a tampering of the... So the question was, if you tamper with one vote, could you prevent decryption? You would be able to tell very quickly which vote had been tampered with, because it's easy to check for well-informedness of each individual votes in these systems. But the bigger worry is if you tamper with one vote, you might be able to change the result without being detected, right? So yes, you do have to worry about these things being correct. And that's why you want to associate votes with individual people who are registered as voters, so you know who's responsible for what encrypted vote, basically. So let me link it back to the scratch and vote, because I just went off into crypto land here, and maybe you're not quite sure why I did that. All right, so this is the ballot. And the parameters are published for the world to see. This time I put Paul as number 1. That way, keep everybody happy, right? These are just public parameters. Number 1 is Paul. Number 2 is Obama. Number 3 is none. And then we decide that the counter size is going to be 10 bits. Maybe that's all we need for this particular election. And so in this 2D barcode now, we're going to include ciphertext for the 3 candidates in the order that they are on the left-hand side of the paper. So that means first the encryption of 2 to the power of 10, since that is Obama, right? He's offset by 1 counter size. The second one, none, is number 3, so that's 2 to the power of 20. And then the last one is Paul, which is just 1, because we said he was the sort of bottommost counter here. And then down here, we put the randomization factors, R1, R2, and R3, that we use in the ElGamal encryption, or in the Payet encryption. It doesn't matter. It's the same concept. Yes?
If you include all the information in the barcode displayed on the website or whatever, right, for auditing, it will also contain all that information, so it will be very easy to restore the order.
So you're saying the barcode contains all that information. It's on the website. Yes, but it's encrypted data. So you can't tell which one is which.
So by barcode, you cannot tell the order of Obama?
No, in fact, what you need is you need to be able to have the randomization factors, which is why we have the randomization factors under the scratch surface, so that when you audit the ballot, you're scratching that off, you get the randomization factors, which allows you to see, aha, that's Obama, that's none, that's Paul. Good, that matches what's on the left side. You need both the barcode and the random factors underneath the scratch surface. Does that make sense? So at this point, maybe I can ask this question. Why do we destroy the scratch surface before, why do we visibly destroy the scratch surface in front of officials before we post the ballot? There, yes? Exactly. Because if I have access to, the answer was you can't show it to the coercer. If I have access to these randomization factors, and my vote is now on the public bulletin board, then I could easily say, see, I voted for Obama. Because with these randomization factors, you can decrypt the ciphertext here. So we show the scratch surface to the election official, and we make sure it hasn't been tampered with to prevent coercion. Does that answer your question? OK, great. Any other, yes?
Cursor is not the election official.
It assumes that there's enough people watching that process. And that's why we sort of rip off the left half before we do it, so that there can be different party officials watching this and making sure that you're not being coerced by an election official. In general, most elections have that central weakness, which is if the election official wants to coerce you, they can put a camera in the voting booth. There's lots of things they can do to figure out how you voted. That's really one of the weakest points in general. But maybe I answered the question, or? Yeah. Any other questions? OK. Here's another question for you guys. From everything I described, there's one thing that if you're paying very close attention, you should be very worried about. And it has to do with the way that we're homomorphically tallying things up. I said, you know, the ones are offset over here, and you just sum things up, and you get the result at the end. Is there anything we should be worried about? Yes? Exactly, exactly. That's much better put than I could have thought. Yes, exactly. The answer was greater than 100% turnout is what we want to be worried about. In particular, if we have a corrupt election official who's collaborating with a corrupt voter, he can hand me the wink, wink, magic secret ballot that contains 42 over here for Obama, so that when I check that box, magically, I add 42 to the Obama counter, and I get greater than 100% turnout. Yes?
Publishing the parameters, what's to prevent the introduction of an external ballot that matches, that has the right barcode?
Yeah.
So you could do it without collaboration.
Yeah, you'd have to associate it with a valid person, and it would have to probably be signed by the voting official at some point. But you're right, that in general, if you're not careful about how these ballots get onto the bulletin board, you could be worried about this in other cases.
I mean, unless the data is also signed, then someone could bring in an external ballot.
So we're getting to a solution there by what you're talking about, what you said is maybe the data could be signed so that we know that this ballot is an official approved ballot, in which case we're still worried about the election officials tampering with it. But yes, we're getting closer to the solution. Did you have another point? Yes?
I was just going to say that even without producing a magic ballot, the person has two ballots there. You vote with both of them rather than you verifying them.
Except that at the end of the day, you have to have one ballot associated with your name on the public bulletin board. That's one of the that's important. It's actually one of the ways you can prevent ballot stuffing in these systems is by ensuring that every ballot is associated with a name. And the question was maybe you can vote with both ballots instead of auditing one and voting with the other. Any other questions about that? And we can make this even worse because I could have plus 42 over here and minus 41 for Paul, let's say, right? And then I wouldn't have more than 100% turnout. I would just be taking votes away from the other guy. The way we fix that, it turns out, is that we can have an extra type of zero knowledge proof inside here, which is called a non-interactive zero knowledge proof that further verifies that all of these ciphertexts encode 1 in the appropriate spot. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but think of it as extra math that provides integrity checks that this is done correctly. And it's even stronger than the signature approach because you don't have to trust anybody. You can just look at the proof and the math will tell you that these ciphertexts, you don't know which one is Obama, which one is Paul, and which one is none, but you know that they're only one of the three and not 42 of one. But that's the kind of stuff you have to be worried about when you use the tricky math, right? Like, hey, summing under the covers of encryption, that sounds great, but you've got all these issues that you have to deal with. Is that clear? So in summary, this is what your ballot looks like. You've got ciphertexts over here in the 2D barcode. You've got randomization factors under the scratch surface. You've got the left side here that better match these ciphertexts, and that's what you audit in the first place. And then you have homomorphic tallying based on the ciphertext here and the selection of the ciphertext indicated by the check mark. That's scratch and vote. Do you start to see, and please say no if you don't, but do you start to see that there's something different about this process compared to other election systems, where now, as an observer, you have the power to look at the public bulletin board and make sure your vote is there. You have the power to re-perform the tallying by multiplying all these things together. And you have the power to look at the proofs, the mathematical proofs, or delegate to somebody nerdier than you, right, to do the proofs for you and make sure that this happened correctly. Yes?
Who eventually decrypts the tally?
Right, so this is an issue that I've kind of swept aside because otherwise there are just too many things to answer. The question is, who decrypts the tally at the end? And the decryption is done by a number of elections officials together in a threshold scheme, meaning that only when they all get together, a representative from each party, let's say, can they perform the last decryption. So we prevent any one party from decrypting a single ciphertext. We just wait for all of them to agree on what the tally ciphertext is, and then they get to decrypt that one. So is that clear? Or if you're unsure of why this is any different process-wise, please ask. Yes?
Can you go over how Alice can verify that she voted, that her vote is actually counted for Obama?
Yeah, so the question is, how does Alice verify that her vote actually counted for Obama? In the fact that Alice gets 2 ballots at the beginning and gets to audit one, meaning making sure that the one she audits is performed correct, has the correct ordering, she gets a certain degree of confidence that the other one does. And you could do it with 1,000 ballots if you wanted more, but that's a little tedious. So instead, in this scheme, we rely on the aggregate of all the voters doing this and making sure that if one of them has an issue, it's investigated more deeply. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was expecting something after the fact, like where she can look at her name.
So in combination with the fact that she can take her ballot home and then check that it's on the public bulletin board, of course, right? So the idea of having these encrypted votes is that Alice gets to keep checking after she's gone, that the vote made it to the bulletin board, that it's still the same given the barcode, that it made it into the tally, and that the decryption happened correctly. So there is that sort of, the moment that you're there in the voting booth, you get certification that it was captured correctly. And then afterwards, because it's encrypted, you can track it like a FedEx package all the way to the end, right? Yes?
The barcode is part of the bulletin board.
Yes.
So she can confirm
The barcode is part of the bulletin board, yes. ideally you have your barcode reader. But like I said, there are some edge issues here to deal with. But yeah. Oh yeah, you can look by hand, sure. Yes?
So the secret key, why it's been kept somewhere or secret split amongst all the parties that are doing final decryption?
That's right. The secret key for decryption has been thresholds shared among the various political parties. So each political party has a share of it, basically. Yeah.
Then it doesn't introduce a problem because once the key is combined, it's like key were to get out.
Correct. If the key were to be recombined, it could be used to figure out everybody's vote, which is why the way you want to do it is with protocols that don't require the physical combination of the key. It allows every authority to perform their share of the decryption and post their share of the decryption on the bulletin board. I didn't want to get into the details of that because it's a whole other chunk to explain. But yes, you have to do that decryption part carefully. Yes.
If it's obvious to all the other parties that this one party is going to win, they could all boycott the election by not giving their portion of the shares, and why?
Yes, and the question is if all the losing parties realize they're losing, they could decide to not decrypt. What you usually do in that case is that you take their share of the key and then you re-secret share that across a whole bunch of the other parties, so that basically if somebody's being uncooperative, the other parties can say, well, we think you're being uncooperative, and recover that share. It gets a little messy and complicated, but that's the general idea, is you do give yourself backups in that case, yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? There's a couple of other really cool things I want to show you, but I'm closing in on the end of our time. People want me to continue? All right, I'm happy to continue. What I want to say is I've presented the system because I think it's useful to present, but there's a whole bunch of other work in this area that I strongly recommend you look into if you're interested. Work by folks like David Chaum and Andy Neff and Ron Rivest and a whole bunch of people. It's just a fantastic area of work. But the one thing I want to tell you about is the question that should be on all of your minds, because clearly when the next election comes, you're not going to be selecting one of the candidates, right? You're going to be writing in your choice. Not everybody does this, of course. Write-ins are this issue that very rarely does a write-in candidate ever win. But the fact that it's there on the ballot can prevent some of the ugliness from happening at the registration of candidates, at the time of registration of candidates, right? There's this sort of disincentive to make it too hard to register as a candidate because you could always run a write-in campaign. Who knows if it really works in that sense, but it's there. And it's one of the attributes that we would have to preserve if we wanted this to be a real system. And there's another issue, which is that sometimes people don't feel so good about the idea that individual ballots go poof, right? The idea that you only get the aggregate at the end of the day, sometimes people aren't very comfortable with that. They want the individual ballots to remain. So there are solutions, fantastic solutions, to being able to anonymize individual ballots instead of using this homomorphic combination to whittle them down to one ciphertext. And the class of protocols that does this is called mixnets. You may have heard of mixnets in anonymous communication protocols. There are different kinds of mixnets. The ones we use in voting are called robust mixnets, or sometimes synchronous mixnets, or basically they do all their mixing in huge batches. They don't mix in small batches like various anonymous email protocols do. This is about waiting for all the inputs and then producing a mixed batch of the inputs. And the idea is that a mixed net is composed of a number of mixed servers run by mutually distrusting parties, right? So think of it as there's a bag of, there's a ballot box of votes, and the Republicans are going to shake it up, and the Democrats are going to shake up the ballot box, and the independents are going to shake up the ballot box. And because everybody's had a turn, everybody can trust that they've shaken it up enough that nobody knows which vote went where. And literally, the idea is to take every individual input and encrypted vote, shuffle them, and output them. The problem is, when you're dealing with data and ciphertexts that are unique, because we said we use randomization so that no two encrypted ballots for Obama ever look the same. Well, if I just take a whole bunch of data and shuffle them, it's not really hard to figure out where they came from, right? They're unique values. They're just bits. How do we actually shuffle them? So we actually need to modify the values along the way. And the simplest way to do that is using something called a Chaumian mixnet or an onion. And that is to say, the value that goes in is not just the encryption of a message, it's the layered encryption of the message. First, the message is encrypted with the last mix server's public key, and then with the middle mix server's public key, and then with the first mix server's public key. So it's like an onion with layers of encryption. And it hopefully doesn't make you cry. But the message goes through the first server, and it gets decrypted. One layer gets decrypted. The mix server can't go any further. It can only do that one layer because only it has that secret key, and it doesn't have the secret keys for the internal layers. So one layer gets undone, and then it gets shifted to a new position, and there you go. So the outputs don't look anything like the inputs. And the same thing for the second mix server. It unwraps one layer, shifts it to a different position. And the same thing for the third one, and at the end, poof, out comes the plain text vote, and we can all count them. Does that make sense? Is there a problem with this system?
Yeah, somebody could prevent one of the mix servers from introducing falsified values.
Exactly, right? I mean, the mix server can do whatever it wants, right? It could, at this point, it could just produce a value that is the double layered encryption of whatever plain text it wants. So how do we trust? We can trust this for privacy, the fact that enough shuffling is happening. But we can't trust this for integrity because the mixnet could introduce any values it wants. So protocols that verify mixnets, there's tons of them, and they're fascinating, and there's so much cool math there. But the simplest one, the most beautiful one, involves very little math. And it's a protocol that's due to Jacobson, Jules, and Rivest, and is from 2002. And it goes something like this. Well, if a mix server has mixed a bunch of votes, let's audit it by asking how it mixed half of them, right? So where did you mix this one? I mixed it here, and here's the proof of how I decrypted it. The mix server has to reveal that information. What about this one, and this one, and this one, and this one? OK. I've audited half of them. And then when we ask the next mix server, well, we're careful to ask about different ones so we don't create a whole path all the way through. We basically query the mix servers and ask them to reveal half of their correspondences with all of the cryptographic information needed to understand how they decrypted it and how they passed it on. And we make sure that there's no path all the way through, otherwise we would reveal how Alice voted. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? It's super simple, and it has some very nice properties, which is that if the mix server screws with one vote, it has a 50-50 chance of getting caught. If it messes with 2 votes, it has a 75% chance of getting caught. And the more votes you get, the higher the probability of it getting caught. If it's messing with 10 votes, it has a 99.99% chance of getting caught, and it's going to get caught, right? It's not perfect, because it could mess with a couple of votes, and we don't really like that. We could do better than that. But it's very clean and very beautiful, and it involves very little math. Does that make sense? There is an operational problem with this, because what happens is that, very much like somebody asked over here, one of the mix servers, let's say the Green Party mix server, could decide, this election's not going so well for me. I'm just not going to mix today. Sorry, I just don't want to do it. I got the secret key. I'm not mixing. Looks like we're losing, So instead, we can do re-encryption mix servers. ElGamal has some beautiful properties. Remember I told you you can multiply ciphertexts, you can multiply values under the covers of encryption? Well, one of those values you can multiply in is 1, right? Take the encryption of a message, multiply it by an encryption of 1, and you get the ciphertext for the same message, but with different randomization. And you don't need the secret key to do that. You just need the public key so you can create the encryption of 1 and then multiply it in. That's all you need. So a re-encryption mix server basically takes its inputs, re-encrypts it, effectively sprinkling in some more randomness, and shifts it to a different position. And if any mix server decides to take the day off, then you can just replace it with another mix server because it has no secret data. There's no fixed secret data ahead of time that it needs to have to know how to do this. Does that make sense? You can still verify this with the same method, But what's really nice with re-encryption mixnets and the properties of ElGamal is you can have all sorts of fantastic protocols that allow you to get much higher probability that no votes were ever messed with. And here is the simplest technique by which you can do that. You have the mix server mix once its true shuffle, the one that's really going to count. And then you have it do kind of a shadow mix, a second one, and also output those outputs over here. Right? So it's outputting its real outputs, saying these are my real ones, and these are my shadow outputs. And then you flip a coin, and you say, OK, either reveal to me your shadow mix over here, all the randomization factor you used and the permutation you used to shift those things around. Or reveal to me the difference between the shadow mix and the real output mix over here. Meaning, what is the permutation that gets me back to the real output, and what are the differences in the randomization factors? If you look at the math, it actually works out. If you do both re-encryptions, you can actually figure out the difference between the re-encryptions. And so by doing this, by saying, OK, give me a shadow mix, and then challenging by saying, give me the pre-mix or the post-mix, you're forcing the mix server to do the right thing. And it could only lie on one of those two, on one side or on the other side. It can't lie on both. So every time you do this, you have a 50% chance of catching it. And the beautiful thing is, you can do this over and over and over again. You can just say, OK, give me another shadow mix. I'm going to challenge you on that one. Give me another shadow mix. I'm going to challenge you on that one. And you do that 80 times, and you've got a 1 minus 2 to the 80 chance that everything went OK, which is basically perfect. You can just keep challenging on shadow mixes and asking it to make sure that it did that correctly. And because for a given shadow mix, you're only revealing the left half or the right half, but never both, you've never revealed the whole mix. In fact, you revealed no information at all about the whole mix. Does that make sense? This should feel similar to the envelope trick I talked about earlier, right? This idea that I present you with some information, I kind of commit to the shadow mix, and then you challenge me on part of it. And if I screwed up on that part, then I get caught. And we can repeat this over and over again to make sure that there's very little chance I screwed up. And all the time without revealing the main mix. Does that make sense? Any other questions? I'm reaching the end here. I talked about decryption. I just want to say a couple words. When we have these anonymized ballots at the end, we need to decrypt them. And we need to do so with a threshold system that allows multiple parties to do that together and no single party to do it alone. Because we don't want somebody to decrypt before the anonymization has happened, before the shuffling has happened. And we want it to be provable. That I'm definitely sweeping under the rug. You just got to trust me that just like you can prove a shuffle, you can also prove correct decryption. There are other math techniques to do that. They tend to be a little more complicated, but it's all, at the end of the day, it's all math related to the ElGamal re-encryption and these interactive protocols for proving that you know how the decryption happened. So at a high level, popping all the way back up, crypto voting schemes all work the following way. Alice and her pals are voting by encrypting their ballot somehow. There are many different techniques. Scratch and vote is one of them. There's a process by which Alice verifies that her vote was properly encrypted and gets a receipt of her encrypted vote. At that point, the encrypted votes go through an anonymization process, which can either be the mixnet or the homomorphic compression. There's a couple of other techniques, but those are the two major techniques. They go through a decryption process, which is threshold, meaning it's distributed among multiple people. So there isn't one group that can do all the decryption. And then the results are posted for everybody to tally. And at every step of the way, there are mathematical proofs produced that these things happened correctly. And Alice can make sure that her vote made it here, that the anonymization process preserved it, that the decryption process preserved it, and that it made it into the tally. The right analogy is some kind of FedEx tracking number that actually has meaning, that isn't just random. And in the first step, you verify that meaning. You verify that it is truly the encryption of your vote. And after that, it's just a tracking number. Yes?
How does she track or go through the mixer?
She can't track exactly what path it takes, but she can see from the proof that it was preserved. all the way through. She doesn't know where it ends up. She just knows it ends up somewhere. The question was, how does she track it through the mixnet? She can't track it exactly, but she can know it's somewhere in there.
Obviously, it's expected that any steps after the encryption, the initial encryption is performed by a third-party auditor.
That's right. So the anonymization steps and the decryption steps are performed by election authorities, and every result is posted on the bulletin board. Think of it as a website where you can go and check and see, aha, there's the data coming in, the votes have now been anonymized and now decrypted, and here are the proofs, I can download them and check them. And literally, you can have anybody do this. The voters, the newspapers, the political organizations, anyone can look at this data and make sure it happened correctly.
So what prevents early decryption? Again, I mean, even with the anonymization, it doesn't prevent early decryption
If the key is found, that's correct. That's why the key is never present in one place. It's generated in a distributed manner. It really is physically never in one place. It's not like the election officials get together, agree on it, and then split it up. They really just have a protocol where it's never physically or even digitally in one place. There's shares of it. It's the piece I didn't describe because it tends to be quite technical, but I'm happy to send references if you're interested. It is, in general, in these voting protocols, there is a way, if all election officials collude, for them to know how you voted, right? If they all collude, they could decrypt your vote. That sounds scary, but it turns out not to be very different from the situation today. If everybody at the polling station is collaborating against you, they can just have the machine tell them how you voted when you scan your piece of paper in. So this is just more explicit about it. Yes?
How many knows that your votes did count?
How does she know that her vote counted? So it's a combination of things. There's not a single check, right? There's the check that it was properly encrypted that she gets to do in the voting booth. And then she checks that when she gets home, she checks that her receipt matches the website. And then she checks that every step was performed correctly.
And when your vote gets on the website?
When does the vote get on the website? There are different theories about that. It could be immediately or it could be at the end of the day. Probably for security purposes, in the fact that you don't want these machines networked all the time, dumping them to the website at the end of the day is preferable. Just for practical security purposes, not for any deep reason.
So this would delay results, though, somewhat, possibly.
Would this delay results? It turns out not so much. That the process for anonymization and decryption of 2,000 ballots, which is bigger than most precincts, is under half an hour of computation time on your average computer.
Sure, but you have to audit it.
Oh, but the auditing can happen afterwards, right? The auditing can happen as long as you want, and the verification takes a lot less time, actually. So once it's posted, what you could do is you can post the encrypted votes, post the proof of anonymization, post the decryption proof. Well, no, post the proof of anonymization and stop here. Give all the papers, an hour or so to check it. Say yes, thumbs up, and then decrypt and produce the results. The important thing to note is that even though election results are given to you the night of, it takes 2 weeks to certify them, meaning the result can change for 2 weeks after the election, and sometimes it does. In this case, this almost certainly wouldn't slow things down any more than they are currently. And the right way to do it would be to produce the result and spend the next 2 weeks verifying and making sure that everything went OK, giving everybody the time to verify it before certification. Yes?
If we assume that the lost votes and miscounts and someone lost the chip that happened are just purely random with some percentage of chance and not malicious, doesn't enough stuff get lost in every election that there's no way you could do this completely?
So the question is, doesn't enough stuff get lost that there's no way you could do this completely? I think if stuff gets lost here, it's really going to happen before it gets posted here. Once it gets posted, it's really just data management by the precinct. And if stuff gets lost at that point, there's a problem. The nice thing about cryptographic voting systems is that when stuff gets lost, you actually know which voters were affected. So you actually could, theoretically, ask them to come back. I mean, there are some process issues around that, but you could, right? Yes?
From the auditing point of view is, from the testing background, is I guess, so you challenge the server, you get a response back, that's black box testing.
Yes.
Versus white box, where you actually would even have the source code and the algorithm. Like, is there an argument to be said that everything along the way should be like verifiable down to the ones and zeros?
It's
not just the result, but the source code that went into.
So that's a very good question. The question is, this is black box testing versus white box testing. Should we be also verifying the algorithms and everything inside there? I believe that, yes, it would be good if all of the code were there for you to verify. But the problem is that you have no idea which code is actually running on the machine. So the only thing you can do is black box testing. And the only thing you can do is verify that the results, not the process, was done correctly. And this is actually a really interesting distinction that at first sounds very subtle, but actually it's very key to this whole thing, which is that we give up on verifying that the source code has been correctly installed. We give up on verifying even that the source code is correct. We only check the results and the mathematical proofs of the result. So it's a black box proof that gives you exactly what you need, which is to say, these ciphertexts were correctly mixed. That's all you care about. So one subtle case where what you're saying matters is, for example, maybe the random number generator that shuffles these things around is not very good, and it didn't really shuffle them very well. We actually can't test for that. We just know that they were shuffled. We don't know how well they were shuffled. And so we fix that by saying a bunch of people will shuffle them, and we hope that at least one of them will do a good enough job. But that's the subtle distinction, and it's what I think is particularly cool about this cryptographic verification, which is that you say, I don't care how you write the code. You want to write it in Fortran? Have a blast. Just, whatever you want to write, that's fine. It actually even enables proprietary models for voting companies that are very afraid of releasing their source code. I don't think they should be afraid, but they are. So we say, OK, don't release your source code, but produce the mathematical proofs that let us know that you did the right job without telling us how you did it. But this is a key question. I'm really glad you asked it. Thank you. Yes? Has this been implemented? It turns out that the company that has come the closest to that has implemented this and come the closest to getting it deployed is a company called Vote Here in Seattle. They have had a very hard time getting this approved and used, even though they've made unbelievable advances in the practicality of it, especially in the vote casting sense. It's very difficult to actually show people and explain to people how revolutionary this is. Because if you look at the talk I just gave, and I've given a dozen of these before, it's really hard to explain to people all the interesting details of it without getting too technical. And this is where this stuff gets really hard and sometimes disappointing, which is that it's pretty advanced. And people believe that because it's advanced, it can't be a good system because a voting system needs to be understandable by everybody and so on and so forth. That's a very deep and interesting conversation. I've written quite a bit about it. My personal feeling is that if the process is public, if the algorithms are public, there are people who can help you verify it. And as long as it's open, as long as the only thing preventing you from auditing is just skills and reading enough books, then that's a much better system than auditing by privilege, being the right person at the right time who gets to audit. So even though this is more technically complicated and the adoption process is bound to be gruesome, I still think it's better because there's no preference as to who gets to audit. If you want to put in the effort, you can. It's open to you.
Aren't there risks that there may not be enough implementers of the system such that one can corrupt the system?
Are there risks that there are not enough implementers and so that one implementer could corrupt the system? I think the right question, or the question that would hit at a closer problem would be, are there enough verifiers? Because if there's only one implementer but plenty of verifiers, it's totally fine, right?
It depends what system the verifiers are using, right?
Oh, well, they should be writing, that's right. So implementers of verification systems, fair enough. Yes, there should be enough implementers of verification systems to make sure that this is done correctly. Is there a risk that there aren't enough? I don't know. I think this would make a very good project for your average grad student or your average, all these folks who want to build useful systems that are of a certain technical level. Great job for Google too. The point is that anyone with a little bit of extra time could write the code, right? And if your family only trusts you to help them with technology, you could write the couple hundred lines of code, because really that's all it is, to verify this. And you could say, yes, I've checked it, it went OK. That's the real power in my mind. And you can ask anybody with the skills, and they can write the verification code. The verification code is much shorter than the proof code, by the way. Yes, another question.
Is it like black box, or is it actually look at the source code and verify? Because there could be overflow problem.
It's a verification of the results of the output. So it is black box in that sense. But it's not just, the results come with these proofs, right? These interactive proofs I mentioned, where the math tells you it must have been done correctly. And I know for folks who are used to testing and sort of black box, white box testing, this is very odd. And this is very weird. It should appear to be very weird. And hopefully, the only thing I can hope for in this talk is to prompt you to look more into it, because all of these cryptographic proofs, these zero-knowledge proofs, are really counterintuitive at first. They really go against the grain of typical software engineering, but they are truly powerful in the sense that you don't need to look at the source code. You just need to look at the output, and the output is self-certifying. Yes, please.
Do people get to choose the random numbers? Because they don't trust the random numbers.
Do they get to choose their random numbers in the process? Wow, that's a really deep question, because if you get to choose your random numbers, then you can maybe put some subliminal information in there, and it gets a little crazy. Choosing the right random numbers is an interesting challenge, and there are different ways to do that. That's a whole other conversation, but it's a good question. Yeah. The hard thing is making sure you're picking good random numbers, but you're not giving individuals in the system too much power that they can start using this as a side channel, basically.
On random numbers, can like voter and say election official just like pick two random numbers and like sort it?
That's correct. So can the voter and the machine pick random numbers together? That's generally the approach that's taken, just getting some randomness from both sides. The problem is making sure you do that without making the process too complicated for voters, right? That's the difficulty. Yes?
So, 2 weeks ago, Ballot was here.
OK, great.
She was talking about, she's from verified voting.
Mm-hmm.
That's not really verified. It's like more easier to audit. That's better.
Yes. So Barbara Simmons was here, you're saying, from a couple weeks ago, and she's from verified voting. And you're saying that's,
I asked her why don't they set their sights on actually any voter being able to verify his vote. And she said that that's not their goal.
right. So you're saying that Barbara Simmons, you asked if why doesn't verified voting set their sights on systems more like this one? Sorry. And she said that's not really their goal. I think, to be as objective as I can be about this, there's a number of people who think, truly honestly, that we are never going to be able to implement these systems, or at least not anytime soon. And so the best we can do is try to implement paper trails and better auditability of existing systems without revolutionizing how they're done. My personal opinion is that if you look at how far the technology has come, and it's much further along than what I've explained here, we are really ready to start testing this stuff. And we actually probably have a duty to start testing this stuff, because in the end, I think it's much more democratic to have as many people as possible be able to verify it. But there are honest disagreements about how ready this technology is. And I think Barbara fits in the category of folks who certainly is aware of this technology, but doesn't think it's quite ready. Yes?
I guess the better question is the issue about whether it's ready as a technological one, or as much whether we can explain it well enough to the society to get them to decide that they're ready.
That's a very good question, which is maybe the readiness is not a technological question, it's a societal acceptance question. I think that's true. At the same time, the argument has often been made that we don't seem to worry about the acceptability of a lot of other technology that we use for life-saving purposes on a day-to-day basis. What we care about is the auditability process and the involvement of enough people. In the case of voting, we should be able to involve as many people as wish to, but I think it's acceptable to require a certain level of technical knowledge to do so. But that's a tough discussion. It's a tough one. Yes. Yes.
Slightly different. It seems that system is more adapted to standard vote counting, which is who got the most votes, with just summing the votes.
Yeah.
But there are all other voting systems which seem to be not as well suited. Like for instance, like multiple checkboxes and so forth.
That's correct. So the question is, what about things that are more than just voting for one candidate? Turns out voting for multiple candidates you can do with homomorphic tallying, and you can probably do with mixednet too. But the interesting question there, when you choose to publish individual ballots, is you hit that issue I was talking at the beginning, which is the inherent limitations of a system when you have a given output. If you give the voter the ability to embed significant information in their ballot, for example, rank the following 25 candidates according to your order of preference, right? Then you could just pick the first 2 you really like and use the bottom 23 to embed information about who you are, right, as a subliminal channel. So the difficulty there is a much more fundamental one. In these other voting systems, how much verifiability can you get if you have this much more information you can embed in the ballot? These systems can be used. It's just they hit a natural limitation much earlier. Yes?
Has no one adopted this, like in any organization anywhere? Or
No one has currently adopted this kind of system at this time. That's right.
Like, couldn't you get like a student body president at MIT, Stanford, get them to adopt it for their university, and then everyone at MIT and Stanford can verify their elections, and then you kind of percolate through the society because everyone voted that way in college.
It's a very good.
You can go on to.
Yeah. So the question is, can we start with student elections and sort of get this stuff through people's heads, and then they get used to it, and eventually the world is a better place? That's a strategy that a few of us have been trying to follow, but it has been somewhat successful to a certain degree. I should give credit to David Chaum and his team because they have used one of these systems, PunchScan, David Chaum's system, which is also a paper-based system, a bit like Scratch and Vote, but with some slightly different technology. And they've implemented it on paper with the printers and the hole punchers and everything they need. And they have run a handful of student elections on it. And they're trying to follow that route. So maybe that is the route that will become successful. There's another point of view that says those will always be looked upon as toy elections, student elections. And in fact, it might be counterproductive to go that route. And we really just need to have a method for testing in real elections. And that method might be you pick a precinct and you say, this year, you guys are the guinea pig precinct, and here's how it's going to work. You're all going to come in and vote using this new technology, and if something goes wrong, you come back tomorrow, vote using the old technology. And that's how it goes. So there are different points of view on this. We have to wrap up. Folks, thanks so much for probably the best set of questions I've gotten on this subject in a long time. Certainly competitive with the folks back at Harvard when I gave this talk over there. Harvard grad students, too. So. If there are any other questions, you can reach me, Ben at eecs.harvard.edu, or you can Google me, I'm sure, and find all my contact information. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much.